Roger Courville has been called the Michael Jordan of virtual presentations. He's an award-winning speaker and author who brings evidence-based tactics to transforming boring webinars. His work includes working with organizations as diverse as Pfizer, FedEx, Australia Institute of Training and Development, American Management Association, US Bank, and of course, Toastmasters. And by the way, he loves habaneros. Put your hands together for Roger Courville.
Woohoo! Thank you, Pamela and Lois and Toastmasters, and it's great to see some familiar faces and some new faces. And I'm glad you're here with me today. I hope to approach this from in a manner that might be a little bit different for you, but for those of you who are of, shall we say, a certain vintage. You might remember Douglas Adams, who wrote a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And one of the things that he said that I think is beautiful with regard to presenting online, he wasn't talking about presenting online, but just technology in general. He says, I've come up with a set of rules that describe our reactions to technologies. One, anything that's in the world when you're born is normal and ordinary and is just a natural part of the way the world works. Anything that was invented between when you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting and revolutionary, and you could probably get a career in it. And finally, anything invented after you're 35 is against the natural order of things. And if there's something in particular that I think is crazier this year than it's ever been, it's that we are living in a world that has little or no historical precedent. There is I mean, I've been in this space for 21 years, and I've just never seen some of the stuff that's going on, as you might imagine. The good news here is that we don't need to panic. And by the way, you're in online Toastmasters. You are already ahead of the game, and I know you know. But here's my opening question for you, and we're going to use this chat a good bit today, and I'm going to ask you at some point to grab a pen or pencil and a piece of paper or something that you can write or draw on. But here's my opening question. When you multitask during a virtual meeting or a class or a webinar, why? Why do you multitask? All right. Either Zoom is slow or nobody multitasks. Something else is more important. Thank you, Lois. I'm bored. Why? Why would you multitask? Yeah, I guess that's a good point. I mean, if you want to learn something. So thank you, Carol and CJ and EVL. That just looks like a little evil, doesn't it? Behind on a deadline, moving my body. Oh, thank you. That is awesome. We're going to come back to that. Trains use of the brain. Okay, beautiful. We're going to come back to that. Here's one of the things that's near and dear to my heart. I've been watching this for a long time, particularly on how people respond on Twitter. And couple of my favorite tweets ever. This guy tweets out, "Webinar is the new waterboarding." and maybe my second favorite, a webinar, seriously? Okay, yeah, I might be able to pencil that in between my 2 p.m. staff meeting and my 3 p.m. ritual suicide. Hey, here's the reality. Attention is at a premium even when we are in person. And crazy enough, this is not a new phenomenon. You're going to hear me share a statistic toward the end of our time together today that shows this has been top of mind for a lot of people for a long time. But if there's an issue on the table, particularly with regard to this particular conference, it's how do I get my audience to remember me? And one of those opportunities, and it's not the only opportunity, I'm going to be really specific here today in terms of what we focus on, is to think about designing in the way that we manage and negotiate engagement. And I like to think of it in terms of like attention, cognition, meaning how do I understand, and repetition. So today is just going to be a number of like bam, bam, practical, tactical design thinking kinds of skills. And here's what I hope for you today, which is I appreciated that our previous speaker mentioned Dan Pink. I love that dude. But one of the points that he makes in Drive is the nature of how we learn. And one of the things that he points out is that those people who are more advanced tend to learn less but get more out of it than, say, people that are newer to a topic, where that delta in terms of how much they don't know to and need to know is larger. Along the way, one of the things that I'm going to encourage you to do is get a copy of my last book, and I'm just going to chat that link out to you. Bam, there you go. That's in chat. You can go back and get that whenever it is that you want. And I'm going to refer back to that probably more than once here today. Thinking task number 1. Think in terms of attention in the context of sensory, cognitive, and social categories. So, probably like many of you, I'm a geek enough to read books about how to make presentations, and I actually read the scientific research. And one of my favorite authors led me to a college textbook where they actually parsed the context of attention into a number of different categories: activity, reality, proximity, etc. And so, to try to make this easier to remember, because if you don't remember it, it's kind of useless, is to say, how do these fit into how we can think differently with regard to designing experience, particularly when we're all sitting in front of our computer screens. So sensory stuff would be like a flash or a change or its activity or something that's near. And of course, not all of these are particular to the nature of online communication, but I think they all fit. How are the senses triggered? The second category is cognitive, which tends to be those things that trigger the brain, right? It can be something that has a ring of familiarity to it, or I understand this is important to me because it's vital to me, which is both. And I think I heard our previous speaker mention that when we think, feel, do, right? Cognitive, affective, and volitional. It's important for us to think about not just brains and senses, but also then the nature of where and how we help people connect in a variety of ways, right? Because we are inherently social creatures. And so that can be the nature of how we relate to spatiality or humor or a number of things. And so the question typically in this context is interactions, though I'm going to focus on this maybe from a little different perspective today. So just remember those 3 categories: sensory, cognitive, and social. All right, another tactic from the world of science. So believe it or not, there are fewer than 80 primary research studies that speak to the issue of PowerPoint. And today is not just about PowerPoint, but we end up using it so much, particularly in the corporate world that I serve, that it's useful for us to be hyper aware of the nature of it. The tactic I want you to remember is to use a complete thought or idea in the slide title. Now, here's the context. This was done at an engineering school, University of Virginia or Virginia Tech, I forget which one, and they tested how headlines affect audience retention of your content with regard to the nature of how a slide is designed. And so one of the things that you'll notice in these 2 slides is that in the upper left-hand corner is a very common thing that we see in slides, which is that the category, it tends to be a category or a placeholder, as opposed to what the study found, which is that putting a complete idea improves content recall. Now, if you notice down here at the bottom, the content recall was 23% relative to 57%, meaning retention or recall of information was better than double when you put the cookies on the bottom shelf. Meaning, and in fact, I think I didn't put in a slide here. I'm just going to give you a bonus idea here. Here is a way to think about this with an analogy from the world of the English language. If you imagine the headline or slide title like the opening line of a paragraph, and then the rest of the paragraph is the supporting evidence of what happens, what supports the point made in the opening line of the paragraph, that opening headline then is supported by what is down below, which functions as the supporting evidence. But the main point is either in the slide title or in some manner that is very quickly apprehendable at a sensory and cognitive level. All right, now I'm going to ask you a question. Get your fingers ready on the chat, because I'm going to ask you, from your point of view, which of the following examples is the smallest acceptable font size? And here's what I want you to do. Figuratively or literally, put your finger on the smallest A-B pairing there that is the smallest acceptable one for you. Okay, you ready? Now what font size is that? All right, so 60, 42, 30, 60, 24. General audience, okay, 42, 24, 12. There's some good pair of eyes. Not everybody necessarily has the kind of vision that I've got right now, right? So this isn't, by the way, this is like looking around the virtual room. You don't have to take my word for it. You can look around the virtual room, or in this case, in chat, and say, oh, this is what my peers are saying, to whatever degree that the hundreds of us here right now represent your audience, right? So point number 3 is engage with back of room font sizes. So one of the things that particularly those of you with any kind of a performing arts background, or we understand this probably from speaking or theater or something like that, is that any kind of a gesture needs to reach people in the back of the room. Well, that kind of makes sense when there are people are differing distances from whatever's happening at the front on stage or at the front of the room, right? Well, when we move into a virtual environment, what we don't control, everybody's in the front row, but what we don't control is the nature of the device that they're joining from. Are they on a 24-inch monitor? Are they looking on a phone? Now, here is the critical piece. Two things that with regard to this. I'm going to drop out of full screen PowerPoint mode here, and I'm going to give you a tactic. Let me just share at the desktop level. I'm going to give you a tactic that gives you a chance to say, how do we think a little differently about this? Okay, so I'm just going to grab a slide and say, okay, text, 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 text. Now, there's two things to remember about fonts. There is no standard font size with regard to point size, meaning 24-point font in Calibri looks very different than it does in say Helvetica or Tahoma or something like that. But here's the thing. Because it is now a relative figure as opposed to an absolute figure, right? There is no one number. There is no one number. It's not like I can just say, hey, you should be a minimum of 30-point font. No, that doesn't work because different fonts show up differently. What I want you to do is go, hey, how would this look if I happen to be looking at this on a smaller screen than the big monitor I've got sitting in front of my nose, or if I'm presenting to my salespeople and some of them might be showing up on iPads or iPhones or something like that, right? Now, all of a sudden, that little font that looked okay when it was on a bigger screen doesn't look so great, right? So the important thing here to remember is that, one, font sizes in terms of what works are relative. And number two, the easy thing to test is to say, how do I cater to the lowest common denominator? Or I should say, I'm typically thinking about how do I cater the lowest common denominator. That's going to be different for you and how you decide to go about things. So, number 4, think skill before tool. Think skill before tool. Now, I purposefully left this little tool up right here this one that in the lower left here, because I'm going to show you something that I think is particularly useful and challenging in today's world. So when I say think skill before tool, one of the things that I want you to do is go, what is the nature of what it is that I do, and how do I engage when I am connecting with people in person? And then say, what is the nature of the tool that maps to, right? Whether that's how do I see if hands are up and I should be calling on someone, or how do I facilitate group chat or something of that nature. Now, here's the reason I think that's really useful or really important, because if I quit sharing my PowerPoint screen, one of the things that many of you already know is that the an increasingly popular set of tools these days is the ability for you to use a virtual camera or some other tool where you can start overlaying titles and lower thirds and playing video into what now was my camera. And one of the things that I think is a challenge sometimes is we start playing with tools sometimes at the expense of the ability for us to say, wait a minute, it's not the golf clubs that make you a great golfer. It's your golf, it's practice, it's your skill that makes you a better golfer. So to me, focusing on tools, it has the tendency, look right at the camera, because you know what, I already shared this link and I'll share it out again here at the end of the presentation. But look right at the camera, because this is near and dear to my heart, because all I do is train speakers and presenters. And to me, if there's something that hurts my heart, is that when we use fancy tools to overcome poor skills. Because what we're talking about here isn't hard, it's just different. Okay, I'm not saying don't use tools like that, but it's kind of like when people discover animations in PowerPoint, and all of a sudden you've got flying crap from Mars coming from every which way but Sunday, because you go, oh, somebody just figured out how animations work in PowerPoint. And yeah, the point is, how do we affect great communication? Number 5, bridge transactional distance with analyze, map, and adapt. Now, I promised that this would be part of this presentation, but on the site where you signed up for this event, one of the things that is on there is a link to a gig that I did for one of the online Toastmasters groups back in June. And I spent a little more time talking about this. Transactional distance is the nature of how in the academic world they think about what it means to be connecting and communicating through a medium. And so, we're connecting through a medium. And to me, I want to say, how do we take whatever it is that we know how to do and move it into a new medium? And here is the simple process that's super simple, but it goes really deep. I want you to analyze everything you do in person. How do you get introduced? How do you deal with handouts? How do you get attention? How do you manage breaks? What do you do with regard to interactions, formal and informal? And by formal, I mean somebody, you get to a particular place and you know that you're going to run a breakout group, or somebody raises their hand in the middle of the process, and do you take the question on the fly? Do you say, hey, can you wait till the break? Right? Analyze everything that you do offline, and then we begin to map it online. Now, here's again why I say focus on skills before tools, because it might be different for you, but in my world, I could be using Zoom one day, GoToWebinar the next day, WebEx the following day, depending on what my client wants. Meaning, if my life is built around a particular set of tools, I'm feeling wonky the minute I step into an unfamiliar room, so to speak, right? So we take each of those things that we're going to do and now map that to the corresponding feature in whatever platform it is that you're using. But I don't want you to stop there. Socially, we notice what we lose before we notice what we gain. I'm going to say that again. Socially, we notice what we lose before we notice what we gain. So most frequently, and I want you to own this because I want you to turn around and teach it to somebody as well. Most of the time, we feel like we've lost something when we move into a different medium. But I want you to think about, say, something disparate, right? You can tell a story in a book, and you could tell a story in a movie, and you could tell the same story to the same audience, but the discipline of telling that story in a book versus a movie would be very different, right? And we don't, well, some of us would argue which one is better, right? But there's things you can do in a book that you can't do in a movie. And there's things you can do in a movie you can't do in a book. And that's what we're getting to here. So we want to analyze what we need to do in one medium, what we're familiar with, presenting in person. And now when we move online, when we're thinking particularly with those things with regard to attention, cognition, and retention or repetition, discover what you can do new, better, or different in the new medium. So this is my reminder to wet the whistle. Quickie summary. And thank you, moderator, and Donna and Corinne. Thank you for that. Corinne says, by the way, Corinne says in PowerPoint, I believe that bigger is better font and less is more in terms of content. Yeah, part of the reason, this is a bonus little idea, and then we move to our second part and closing out. The brain sees words as an image before it kicks into reading mode. So most of the time, if you're using just very few, I'm going to go back a slide, just a couple. To me, usually when I'm thinking about how I would construct, and now I'm not saying you have to do it the way that I do it, but I'm usually thinking about how do I make this slide something that can be instantly grasped without kicking the brain into reading mode. Because when the brain kicks into reading mode, one of the it changes in orientation in terms of how it relates to content, right? It's typically why having a huge pile of text on a slide is ill-advisable. Now, I am not a purist, right? I am not the only put images and don't ever put words on slide kind of guy, but it's certainly useful to think about where and how you are very purposeful about what part of the experience you're facilitating at any point in time. Notice in this particular case, I'm staying a little longer on this slide so that you can go, oh, yeah, this is a reminder for me that back of room font sizes is something that's particular to my organization, or that's something I'm going to need to test the next time I'm putting a presentation together for my virtual speech. So as we roll, tap into picture superiority effect. If you look it up, picture superiority effect is actually something that they begun to test in the 1980s. I think they knew instinctively that it was around for a long time, but it was really validated in the 1980s, and it has been revalidated multiple times. And picture superiority effect is quite simply the phenomena in which pictures and images are more likely to be remembered than words. Now, for me, this is a side note, for me, sometimes the reason to put text on a slide is when you need to represent something very specifically or accurately, right? Maybe you're in a field like legal or medical, where one of the things that is particular to you is sometimes being very clear and specific about the languages being used. That's okay. I'm not, again, like I said, I'm not a purist. But here is the point of the show where the goal is to have you grab a pen or pencil and a piece of paper, or you're just going to have to do a mental exercise, because I want you to draw something. And I'm going to keep an eye on my countdown clock here in front of me. But here's the exercise. In terms of growing in the process of thinking visually, I want you to draw an image. It could be a stick figure because nobody's going to see it. How would you represent achievement if you were going to draw a picture of something that represented achievement? Here's another way of thinking about that if you're not a drawing person. If you wanted to represent achievement and you went to a stock photo vendor and you're looking for an image that would represent achievement visually, what would that be? Thank you, Nadia. Already ahead of the game. Hold up a Super Bowl trophy. Woohoo! Okay, you're ahead of me. So let's let me test this in a different way, and I'm gonna do this for a reason, and then I'm gonna come back and ask you what you drew. Okay? So, what visual is most like what you drew? Now, I'm gonna use letters, and you can just type in the letter as opposed to the description. Is the visual that you drew or conceived of more like measuring or honoring? Saw one of those go by, hands up in the air, thank you. Symbolizing or expressing. Now, believe it or not, there's probably 24 different ways. So if you look right smack in the middle, I'm going to call E other. Okay, so moderator says B, Roxanne says B, Pat says D. Oh, good. Ida says both, expressing and honoring. And by the way, if you're in that other category, what did you draw? Just out of curiosity, or what did you conceive of as being able to visually represent the idea of achievement? We'll see if any other crazy ideas. I've literally had somebody type in going, I drew a picture of a young couple holding a new baby. Like, where'd that come from? I guess that's an achievement for some people. For some people, that's an accident. Some people, that's an achievement, right? So, oh, a brooch. Oh, very cool. Thank you, Rosemary. A target. Thank you, Annalise. Okay, very cool. A wave line going up. Okay, you get the idea. All right. Here's the idea. When we come to the idea of thinking experientially in terms of how do we design an experience that might be a little different, I think it's useful for us to think beyond not just think beyond the slide, but also what we just demonstrated, which is to think beyond the device. Think beyond the device. So we've talked about saying, hey, where do I not just design slides, but where and how do I direct attention? Hey, in the lower left-hand corner of your Zoom viewer, you will see, or GoToChat, or having directed activity of something takes passive participants and turns them into active participants. What is one of the critical elements of memory? Is some kind of an anchoring, and there's multiples, right? Emotion and a number of things, but one of them is activity. Meaning there's a reason why we want small class sizes for our kids, right? It's because there's more particular and attention for them, which is different than sit and listen to a lecture on an ongoing basis. G says, I drew the sun and a bouquet of flowers. Sweet, thank you. All right, couple final thoughts. And then I'm just gonna, open it up for questions and or on the fly kind of stuff until Pamela kicks me out of here. Okay? Study Hollywood's attention tactics. So for me, because I started going a long time ago, one of the things that I realized was, I decided anyway, I hope you agree, is that the psychosocial experience of someone attending your virtual presentation is actually more like watching television than it is an in-person seminar experience, right? So one of the things that I just decided that I was going to do is start to study, and this is literally the very first thing that I ever studied, not the only one now, but the very first thing I did is I went online and found which in my case was OPB, Oregon Public Broadcasting, and watched an episode of History Detectives, which is a favorite show of mine. I just love what they do. Now, this is a documentary. And what I decided I was going to do is in the documentary or in the show is count the number of camera cuts. Now, a camera cut in Hollywood language is a change of scene or angle, right? Like there's one camera here and it cuts from that camera to this other camera, or something that provides a visual trigger because it's not the same thing on an ongoing basis. Now, here's my question for you. In one 17.5-minute story on History Detectives, how many camera cuts were there? Just out of curiosity. Any wager, any guests? And by the way, in addition to having a little fun and playing along today, I would encourage you to test this. Literally go watch any, 5 minutes of television and just keep track of it, right? Because in this case, this was History Detectives. This isn't a Bruce Willis flick, right? So more than 2 a minute. We got 3,000. Thank you, Julian. I think that's probably in the top end. 100, one every 3 minutes, 1,500, more 134, 150, 340. Okay, 1,750. Thank you. Here it was 301, which in this case was every 3.5 seconds. Now here is a sobering thought. I am going to argue that your audience is being enculturated in a manner that they probably don't even realize, which is a very different experience what they are used to seeing and how they're used to being triggered when they watch television, as opposed to when they move in, when go to a seminar and attend an event. I think it's really useful for us to abandon whatever kind of idea you had about slides in an in-person context and say, hey, when we do this online, one simple way, it's not the only way, but one simple way is to increase the rate of visual change, which could be more slides, not more content. By the way, I'm just going to back up there for just a second. So I'm working with a corporate client, and literally I had my corporate client come to me and she says, my boss says I can't show up with more than 7 slides. And I think he just read a book called literally The 7-Slide Solution. And I said, interesting. I said, let me ask you this. When your boss says he doesn't want you to show up with more than 7 slides, what does he really want? And she's like, huh? And I said, well, no, what's he really want? Well, I don't know. I said, well, how do your slides look? And she says, well, I spent all my time trying to cram things in there, tiny little font sizes. And I said, there you go. I said, how long could you speak to one slide? And she was, that was it. What he wanted was brevity. And the way he was communicating it was, I want you to have fewer slides. The whole point being, you could talk to one slide for 7 minutes, and you could talk to 70 slides in 10 minutes or something, and just keep it moving, which I think is useful and this is my final point here, in terms of taking a lesson from Hollywood, which is to reclaim attention with pattern interrupts. Now, I'm going to just watch what happens with your Zoom player when I do this. Even just something as simple as, and you saw it earlier, playing a poll, tell somebody to go, grab something in chat, turn off PowerPoint, turn PowerPoint back on. Any one of those kinds of things is a useful tactic relative to what we know from the world of neurolinguistic programming, which is that pattern interrupts get or reclaim attention. So because I'm a geek and I read this stuff, literally out of the University of Southern California, one of the studies that they did was looking at attention and the nature of history with regard to film, right? Movies. And they looked at everything from Gone with the Wind to Jaws to Star Wars and the blockbuster movies over the course of 70 years. And Interestingly, this is how, now this is an academic paper, right? This is published in the Association of Psychological Science. Literally the way they begin, because they're doing a primary literature review, is to say, what grabs people's attention? The question has, I'm going to read this verbatim, but not something I would recommend doing for extended periods of time, but I want to be really clear about the nature of what we're up against. He says, it says, this question has been central to psychological research for a long time. Notice this, goes back to like, people are studying attention back to 1890. I mean, probably farther than that, but in terms of an academic bit of research to find. And then it says, once observers' attention is grabbed, can they hold it there? Get this. Studies of, and they call this vigilance, which is how much can I focus, even when I want to focus. Studies of vigilance show that generally people cannot continue to pay attention, even when they want to. So, what does that mean for us? Well, I'll tell you how it relates. I think of it. Me and my PowerPoint and Zoom doesn't hold a candle to Peter Jackson and Lord of the Rings. Therefore, the question is, what am I going to do? And is there something I can learn from Hollywood that might be useful? In the paper, one of the things that was, I think, particularly useful for us to remember is what they called a moment of urgency. And this is kind of like a capstone. If we go back to our sensory, cognitive, and social aspects of attention, a moment of urgency is something that reclaims attention. Now, that could be a loud noise. It could be something that changes in the periphery of vision, right? So when I did something like stop screen share and then restart screen share, it doesn't take too much for you to figure out, oh, Zoom jumped on my desktop. And so I'm not my desktop, your desktop. Even something as little as that can be part of your design tactic, meaning I don't have to push PowerPoint continuously if that's part of one of your tactics. The key here is, at what point is there a moment of urgency where you are purposeful about grabbing or re-grabbing attention? Because if there is no such thing as perfect attention, the question now is, what are we going to do to become kind of like Hollywood directors? I like to think of you as a director of attention. And this is also validated in Dr. John Medina's book, Brain Rules: content, pattern, interrupt, content, pattern, interrupt. And here's the key, something to remember. This interval right here and this interval right here needs to be shorter the longer you go, right? Somebody has the most sustaining ability. They have the highest potential vigilance at the beginning of your presentation, and it gets shorter the farther you go. The whole point being here is there is no perfect answer that says you should interact every 4 minutes in a web. No, that's baloney. What we do know is that we can't assume that we've got 100% attention. And now the question is, what are we going to do about it purposefully? Well, when it comes to you being memorable for your audience, the remaining few things that we talked about here was tapping into picture superiority effect. There are times when images, it's quite literally true that an image can be worth 1,000 words. Not always, by the way, but very, very powerful. Particularly for those of you who are in a corporate environment, it's really useful to remember, because get this, difference between presentation and documentation. In the corporate world, it's very common that people's PowerPoint isn't used as a tool of visual communication. It's used as a tool like Microsoft Word. It's just another form of a document. And big difference there. picture superiority effect, particularly when you're in a presentation kind of an environment. Think beyond the slide, meaning there's more of an experience just beyond to designing an experience than just what is on a slide. Think beyond the device. Could you have somebody, by the way, how many different ways could we have somebody do something that gets beyond the device with regard to the experience? I forget who mentioned it, but a little earlier, one of the opening comments when I said, when you multitask, why might you do that? And somebody said, I need to stand up and stretch. Well, there you go. What if you were purposeful about leading a group of stretching exercises, or just say, hey, stand up, shake it out, put your left foot in and take your left foot out and put your left foot in, shake it all about, right? So how do you become a director of attention, but more importantly, not just attention, but doing those things that move people in a psychosocial sort of way? And finally, from Hollywood, attention can be both a function of a moment of urgency and being purposeful on your end, saying, I know that whatever the pattern is, I need to interrupt or disrupt that every once in a while, because that's just how we are. That's just how we work. So my final closing thought for you today, and I know we're specific to the design topic here today, but to me, this touches down in a way that's way bigger than webinars. Some of you have heard my story, right? In 1983, I was driving a car that literally ended up in a front half and a back half. That's the back half of the car. That's the front half of the car. And yeah, crazy enough, my mom still has these Polaroids. Remember Polaroids? But here's what this reminds me of, and here's why I think this touches down for each of us when we spend a lot of time now thinking about things like making virtual presentations. There are way more things that are important than Zoom and WebEx and PowerPoint. And in my office hangs this sign that says, you can't make footprints in the sands of time if you're sitting on your butt. And who wants to make butt prints in the sands of time? I'm a particularly big fan of saying, hey, we don't live in a world that we grew up in, right? I don't know how old you are, and I'm not going to ask, but I do know that what we're doing here today didn't exist, let alone for me in a case, being able to make a career in. And yet the problem is easily solved, not because it's hard. I mean, I should say it's not hard. It's just different. So if we take a step back and we go, hey, the beginning of someone remembering who you are is the distinction that you create that gets and keeps attention, right? I think if you pause and just go, hey, that could be sensory, cognitive, or social. How am I thinking about this slide, this interaction, this piece of content that I'm delivering? Is there a way that I could conceive of this in a manner that helps me get and keep attention? This will help you think through the things that you can do to take whatever it is that you're doing to the next level. Use a complete thought in the slide title. Easy for you not only to do, but it's easy for you to share with others and be a hero in the same way. Engage with backroom font sizes, analyze, map, and adapt. Tap into picture superiority effect. Remember, thinking visually doesn't have to mean pretty pictures. Picture superiority effect is not a function of putting up a picture of the Matterhorn. It's a function of saying, I understand that at both the sensory and the cognitive level, that there is something different that happens when people engage visually. So how do I think visually to get there? Think beyond the slide and beyond the device. Study Hollywood's attention tactics like that moment of urgency, or being able to connect with pattern interrupts. And finally, today's today's session really is the tip of the iceberg. Got a whole bunch more ideas in the book, a couple of the studies that I've done, which has been more than one. And if there's something that I want to thank each and every one of you for, it's just being part of an organization that says, how do we just grow? And I love Toastmasters for the fact that whether it's the presentation track or the leadership track, the opportunity for human beings to grow and not be the same person tomorrow that I was yesterday is one of the most powerful things that Toastmasters brings to the table. Not the least of which, of course, is then making things like this available to you and everybody here. So, thank you, Pamela. Back to you. I'm about horse, and I'll just take
You're
a sip of
about
water.
horse.
And
I have 2 questions for you.
let's do
One
it.
person wants to know what the most challenging situation you've been on in online, and the second thing they want to know is what happens when they turn. What do you do when they turn off their monitors? What do you do? Do you talk louder? How would we handle that? 2 challenging situations.
Repeat the first one to me, and let's come back to it.
What's the most challenging situation or environment you've been to online? Second is what happens when they turn off their monitors? What do you do as a professional presenter when you're in a challenge? What's the most challenging? How'd you handle it? And turning off your monitor. I think those are probably the 2 of the hardest things to deal with, but.
Yeah. Here's, one of the greatest challenges, if you think in classic story terms of like man versus environment, man versus nature, man versus disaster, man versus self, I think us against ourselves is the biggest challenge. We hear differently, we see differently, and here's one of the things that we know, and I forget the piece of research that backed this up, but one of the primary bits of research in the world of virtual learning was why and how facilitators or instructors need individuals in the audience to interact. And what is the nature of that, and why what could they draw from that? Here's what they found. Because we feel a sense of disconnect, right? When we hop into Zoom, the default nowadays is that, okay, let's have everybody turn on their camera. The problem is Zoom only shows so many cameras, and that would actually be kind of useless if there was 500 cameras on anyway, right? I can't really read my audience if every little thumbnail is about 1/4 of an inch across. So to me, the biggest challenge is between my ears. This is just me, as in how do I realize what I'm bringing through the microphone, through the camera, what I'm doing. And the second is, and related, how many of the times am I doing something because I need to feel or hear, I'm doing air quotes here, need to feel my audience, but that's for me, as opposed to it being something that is designed to enhance them, right? And that's for me, one of the great travesties in the industry, and I'm going to say this because many vendors are my clients as well. Their simplistic answer is, oh, you should engage people by pushing a poll. But you know what? If I said, hey, everybody, raise your right hand, and you all raised your right hand and went, okay, what's up now? And that activity didn't have a point, you'd realize that I just wasted your time. Right? And to me, a lot of the activity that we seek is often serving our own feeling of disconnect, instead of saying, how do we do things that are designed to engage at that sensory, cognitive, and social level. With regard to the nature of the most challenging thing, Pamela, give me the second question again.
The one is if they turn off their cameras.
Oh, turn off their.
And also, I know as a private tutor, I'm online a lot, and if I don't have a certain rhythm going throughout the hour, I mean, you just feel it nosediving. And so you talk about that you need things back, but there has to be that rhythm, that communication, which I see you doing with the audience. You're asking for information, and then you're taking that and you're reacting. And so if you don't keep those slides moving, if you don't keep that rhythm moving, you really start to go downhill. And how do you keep that up when you have a blank screen? I know if it's 500, but if you've got some important people, you need to reach them. That's your job.
Yeah. Well, and that relates to the previous question. We often rely on, and I think I'm just going to state what I stated maybe in another way. We often rely on people turning on their cameras as our proxy or our visual, our feedback for going, oh, are they here? Are they with me? Are they paying attention? And now the question is, well, what happens when I don't have that, or when they turn off their camera? And so here's what I would remember. The dynamics of interpersonal communication change as the audience size scales, right? And this in person, and it's the same when we do it online. It's different when there's 5 of us as opposed to when there's 15 of us or 50 or 500. And that's true. So now the question is, what do I do relative to the size of audience that I have? And I'll share with you one example that I like from a couple of the other conferencing tools. GoToWebinar has this, Adobe Connect has this, WebEx has this. Zoom used to have it and took it out. It's called an attention meter. And what it does is it detects the active application on the desktop of the audience member and registers them as attentive or inattentive based on whether or not Zoom or whatever is the active application. Now, the point is, it can give you an aggregate, meaning it can be part of a dashboard that you keep an eye on and going, hey, attention is starting to wane. Back to skills versus tools. What do you do when audience attention starts to wane when you're in person? You change it up. You take a break. You have people stand up and take a stretch break or something like that. So to me, I would say, how do you learn a new set of tools in terms of how you keep your eye on your audience? And if you default to camera, the skill is, how do I keep an eye on my audience? The tool is camera or not. And I would get beyond just camera and think, there's more than one way to do that. So.
Thank you, Roger. We really appreciate your time. Can everyone applaud Roger and all the time and the energy he's given us here, and especially the book? If you want to leave a comment, I'd like to turn it back to Lois, our co-chair.
All righty. Thank you so much. Did I tell you were in for a treat? We are going to be having in the chat box a survey for Roger. So please make sure you take a couple of moments to fill that out. Roger, as always, you were fabulous. Thank you so very much for being here. I did take a lot of extra notes. I'm still working on that, flip back and forth between the PowerPoint and the Medium here, but I'm working on it. I'm going to get there.